My name is Nathan. I'm with New Zealand Landcare Trust. I'm the regional coordinator here in Hawke's Bay. Have spent a little bit of time up in Northland. Previously worked for Northland Fish and Game in a past life, and have worked with John on a few projects in the past. So I'm very familiar with Northland and recognize a few names there. So today we're going to talk about wetlands and your farm environment and your farm environment plans. And this is going to be a little bit of basically you get your farm environment plan, what do you do next, and basically planning around your wetlands and that kind of thing. So if most of you probably haven't in Northland dealt with a farm environment management plan, but you'll sit down with beef and lamb or a consultant, and this is what you usually put together. You put a mapping exercise that you identify a lot of things, and which includes wetlands. You identify risk on your property and critical source areas. You develop a nutrient budget based on overseer, and then you stock exclusion planning. And then usually if you got a good provider, you put a list of good management practices together that you're going to implement on your property. And then this action list, and this is sort of where we're going to be sitting today, is all right, once you get your farm environment plan, how do you put your action list together, and how do you organize around wetlands and what you need to do around your wetland areas? Why are wetlands important? Well, the freshwater policy statement, which is just put out a couple years ago, basically in policy 6, they said there's no further loss of extent of natural inland wetlands. Their values are protected and the restoration is promoted. And so that sits there, and that's why wetlands are actually becoming an important part of that farm environment planning, is because New Zealand's lost 90% of their wetlands and 10% are left, and some of those are very degraded, but that makes them extremely important. The management of wetlands usually falls under the Resource Management Act. And the wetlands, it's defined in the Resource Management Act as wetland is permanently or intermittently wet. And that intermittently wet is actually an interesting area because we lost most of our ephemeral intermittent wetlands because they were the easiest ones to drain. And we still lose some in some regions. Then it goes shallow water. So not all wetlands have open water. Some of them, the water is just sitting right there at the ground level. So it doesn't look like a wetland to you, but it does, it can't support terrestrial grasses and trees and stuff. Land water margins. So this is that's around lakes and stuff, because lakes generally have this wetland margin. The lake itself isn't considered a wetland, but the margin is usually considered a wetland. And the key point here is it supports a natural ecosystem of plants and animals that are adapted to wet conditions. And this is where that's important in the long run. There's been a little bit of confusion around wetlands and what you can and can't do, and what there is. The national policy statement basically says that wetlands constructed by artificial means. So a lot of times your duck ponds and some of the aesthetic wetlands you put for aesthetics and stuff, they're not considered a natural wetland under the legislation. So there's really no rules and regulations around those. Geothermal wetlands, well, I won't talk about too much. There's very few, and most of them in Northland are already protected, so we won't even go into the geothermal ones. And then this C is a really interesting one. This is any area of improved pasture at the commencement date, which is the commencement date of the freshwater policy statement, which was, I think, 2 years ago, that is dominated by more than 50% exotic pasture species and is subject to temporary rain-derived water pooling. So this is those ephemeral wetlands that have been developed over time, or drained wetlands that have been planted in grasses and stuff. They are not covered as long as they weren't planted with exotic pasture grasses prior to the commencement of the legislation. So as an ecologist, you got a legal definition, but you also got a natural definition. And when we look at wetlands and try to identify wetlands, and your planner and your consultants will help you with when they're doing your farm environment plans. We'll look at the hydrology, whether the water is present at surface and that root zone of for the portion of the growing season. So basically, the land's waterlogged, and if the land's waterlogged, it generally indicates a wetlands. We look at the soils and those hydric soils. Again, those waterlogged soils, if we got those waterlogged soils, we know it's a wetland. And then what most ecologists will look at is the biota, and they'll go and they'll look at the native sedges and grasses and that kind of thing that actually wet feet and need to be in those saturated soils to grow. And they usually use that to start identifying a wetland, but you really need to look at all three. But most people will just look at the biota, and it usually is an indicator of the other two. So for this presentation and further on, I'll give some definitions. So when we talk about things, you'll know what I'm talking about. Restoration. So wetland restoration refers to returning the wetland to a former condition. And that definition is changing a little bit, but it's basically returning the hydrology of the wetland back to some condition where it's functional. Creation is basically putting a wetland where none existed before. And then we've got constructed wetlands. And when we say constructed wetlands, we usually think about wetlands that are used to treat water, to usually stormwater, municipal water, industrial wastewater, even effluent from dairy sheds and piggeries and that kind of thing. And those constructed wetlands are basically a subset of a creation wetland, but they're basically designed just for water treatment. And then we've got wetland enhancement, and that's usually falls under activities to increase the function of wetlands. So enhancement is most of our planting programs that we do. We plant in wetlands and stuff is an enhancement. It's not really restoration, because if the hydrology is there, the wetland doesn't need restored, but it's just putting species back into that wetland to give it a little bit of movement forward. So you get a farm environment plan, and you get this stack of papers, and you look at your map, and your map says, well, over here's a wetland, over here's a wetland, here's a wet area that probably was a drained wetland. And then you're sitting here like, oh, now what do I do with all this information? And basically we look at it and we say, all right, when you first think, you need to prioritize what you want to do, because it's daunting when you're looking at a farm environment plan, and there's like got all these GMPs, you got all this stuff to do, and you're like looking at this and what do we do? How do we prioritize? So when it comes to wetlands, we prioritize our wetlands with protecting those existing wetlands. They're a rare habitat. And that's usually just stock exclusion, fencing to exclude stock from it, fencing with a buffer. You can't spray within 10 meters of a wetland, so a 10-meter fencing around that wetland buffers is probably a minimal that you should do. It's probably the bigger the buffer, the better protection of your wetlands. And also, after protecting those existing wetlands, is if they've been logged out or something before, is actually planting some trees and stuff and shrubs that are missing from those wetlands. As you're looking at that farm environment plan, you say, all right, we need to fence that wetland, we need to fence this one, but we've got these wet areas over here that were wetlands that, my grandfather, the previous landowner, tried to drain out, and they just haven't worked. And that's where we get into this restore the drained or damaged wetlands. And that would be your second on your priority list. It's like, all right, we have this area. If we could restore this, not only will we create wildlife habitat, but we'll also improve water quality and that kind of thing. So that would be second on your priority. And usually restoring wetlands is really fixing the hydrology. Most of the wetlands in New Zealand have basically been drained. And then after you restore it, stock exclusion. Now, the reason we put these first is actually your existing wetland and your damaged wetlands, when they're restored, are actually better at removing nutrients than creating a new wetland or constructing a wetland, because they've got an existing load of carbon to help with denitrification and that kind of thing. So we always prioritize those two first. So you go on your farm environment plan, you say, oh, our farm has a high nitrogen load or runoff, or a high phosphorus runoff, or sediment road runoff and stuff. And then it's like, well, can I use wetlands to treat my nutrient runoff? And yes, we can use wetlands to treat our nutrient runoff. And that's where we get into this constructed wetlands. And they're really effective at nitrogen, removing nitrogen, and decently effective at removing phosphorus, and a little bit of E. coli. And sediment, you don't want to go into your wetlands because they don't become a wetland after too long if you've got sediment loads coming into it. So again, wetland protection, not all wetlands have open water. A lot of them are just sedgelands or shrubs, shady, but protect them, fence them off, and protect them is high priority on any farm. I want to touch base just on one wetland that's not really covered in the legislation. It's not covered by a lot, but it is extremely important from a biodiversity standpoint and a water quality standpoint, and it's these small seepage wetlands. The freshwater policy statement identifies wetlands that are half hectare or more. But these small seepage wetlands, we found from research with Dairy NZ and NIWA, are actually really good at removing nutrients. And I'll say basically needs a little bit of a lot of them just need a little bit of fenced off and livestock exclusion, and allow the vegetation to grow back in. Here's one that was fenced off, and you can see that light green is all native sedges that are growing in through there that are creating this nice seepage wetlands. And so they're not included in there, but if you can identify them on your farm environment plan, they're important to protect. One way sitting there about protecting wetlands, and so, what do we do first and that kind of thing. We always got to weigh advantages, disadvantages, pros, cons of things. Seepage wetlands generally are low cost. It's a little bit of fencing. Yeah, fencing's a little expensive, but they're small areas, so it's not that much, and a little bit of fence maintenance. They're easy to implement. You identify them. You can put a fence around it. Any landowner can do it. It's not that problem, not that much of an issue. They're easy, cheap to maintain. It's just a little bit of fence maintenance. They're basically small areas. They do have some biodiversity values. We're finding actually some of the tuna or eels actually spend during the dry time of the periods will go up into these seepage wetlands and burrow into the seepage wetlands and wait for a rainflow. And they slow water down coming off the landscape, so which will reduce flooding. And the main disadvantage is if you got high strength effluent, they won't reduce a lot of nutrients from it. They just can't handle that high strength effluents. You can put weirs in some of the seepage wetlands to enhance them for removing the nutrients. So if you do stick those weirs in, there's a little bit of maintenance costs with those. So really, basically, there's not a lot of disadvantages to protecting those seepage wetlands, and they're very important. So when you're prioritizing those wetlands and protecting them, remember to look at those seepage wetlands. Restored wetlands, again, usually we restore wetlands where they've been, we're restoring wetlands. Usually they've been drained. They're usually poor production areas, unless you're in some of the peat areas. There are not too many of those in Northland. After they're restored, they're easy and cheap to maintain. A little bit of weed control. Definitely lower cost than if you want to construct a wetland to reduce nutrients. They are really effective at reducing nutrients. High biodiversity values, and yeah, most of our wildlife that are in threatened and endangered are actually directly linked to wetlands, so they really do have high value. Again, we're reducing downstream flooding. Again, not suitable for high strength effluents. So if you can't put high strength effluents down, but if you got nutrient runoff off paddocks, it will help reduce those. To restore a wetland, most times it will require a resource consent because some of those restored wetlands are still considered a wetland. Sometimes they're considered, they'll fall under that category of that, if they have more than 50% pasture grass, they don't fall under the wetland category. But definitely, if you're looking at restoring a wetland, talk to somebody who knows something, talk to the regional council, land management officers, and that kind of thing. Usually when restoring wetland, there's a large land requirement, but again, we go back to, it's usually poor production land. So there's a trade-off there. A lot of techniques we use to restore wetlands and enhance them. The main ones we use are filling drainage ditches and stream flows. Of course, we've got a lot of exotic species that we got to deal with, and sometimes when we're restoring wetlands, we got to add some plants and that kind of thing into it. So there's a lot of techniques we have. And again, if you're going to restore a wetland, have a chat with the regional council, Fish and Game, even John will put you in the right place, the right people to talk to if you have a chat with him. An example up in Northlands, just south of Whangarei. Many of you might have seen this place before, but this is a wetland. It has a little bit of a slope here, but it's still a wetland. And you can see that there's a couple drains going down through. It's a perfect place to restore a whole area of land that actually drains into this wetland. By restoring that surface flow off this land into the wetland will help reduce water quality in the following stream. It'd take a little bit to fix this or restore this, but it's, as you can see, there's really good grazing habitat, and there's really poor stuff, and that poor stuff is basically in that wetland. And a farmer who has a situation like this, you're not losing a lot of productive land by restoring the wetland, and you're gaining more in biodiversity and aesthetics than you would by grazing that. And the last on your categories is constructed wetlands, and they do generally have a high ecological value, even though they are designed mainly for water quality. You have an opportunity to treat high contamination. So I've seen some wetlands overseas on piggeries and dairy farms that the effluent goes into the top end, and there's usually 12 or 13 wetland cells. And by the time the water comes out of the bottom, it's clean enough to drink. And I know one guy who's made these up in Ireland, and he does drink the water, showing how effective these wetlands are. But when you got a high effluent, they require a high retention time. That's why there's 12 cells. It just slowly throughs. On average, when you're treating effluent, your wetlands, the movement through your wetlands shouldn't be more than a meter a day. Generally, we're not worried about that high effluence when we're doing farm environment plans, so don't worry too much about it. Disadvantages, large land requirements. And again, those land requirements are usually flat lands, which, is usually prime grazing land, prime cropping land, that kind of thing. May require resource consents. Usually they do, basically not because of disruption. It's more of the amount of soil that you're moving usually exceeds what you're required to move for land disturbance. Constructed wetlands have a high maintenance commitments. You usually got pipes in them and move fluids from one cell to the next. So maintaining those pipes and keeping those clear so water can move through. And again, high construction costs compared to restoring wetlands. You're going to pay 6, 7, 8, 10 times more to do it. So when we look at constructive wetland design, or if we're looking at restoring wetlands and their ability to remove nutrients, the wetland size should be within 1 to 5% of the catchment area, and to actually effectively remove mainly nitrogen and phosphorus from the overland flow. So surface flows, it's overland flows is generally what we use constructed wetlands for. And when you construct them, you want them oval shape, and multi-stage systems, and this length width ratio of 5 to 1 to 10 to 1 are ideal. And I'll show you a picture of one and we'll talk about it. Usually your constructed wetlands follow a pattern: open water, deep sediment pond at the beginning, shallow area which allows for emergent vegetation to grow. So that's vegetation that grows into water out. So that's your rushes, your reeds, that kind of thing is about 70% of the wetland area. And then you have this open water deep at the bottom of your wetlands. Here's a constructed wetland that NIWA and Hawke's Bay Regional Council did a couple years ago. We've got a sediment pond here at the top, and this is just, they're actually in the process of planting this one. I was trying to find a picture of it with water and flowing in, and I didn't have an aerial photograph of it, unfortunately. But usually there's pipes that go through from one wetland to the next. This one actually has an overflow, but there's usually pipes that go through. And it just slowly works its way through the system: open water, open water, shallow water, and moves its way through. This one, I think, is 1, 2, 3, 4, is 5 cells, and then it goes into the stream. Expensive to do. You can see a lot of excavation, a lot of dikes. All the soil that was excavated was hauled up here. All that soil up there was pulled out of this. So you can see how it can get very expensive really quickly to build one of these. And then these poor guys were planting rushes at half-meter spacing through this whole thing, thousands and thousands of rushes. They're very effective planters, but you're talking about $2 a plant. It adds up really quickly. I tend to prefer and have done quite a few of what I'm calling end of field wetlands. So they're basically taking that constructed wetland design, but using them to treat smaller areas. So this wetland here actually has a wetland shallow area and then a deep area down into, and there's a reason for that deep area there, down into another shallow area, and then another shallow wetland, and then there's a deep area down there. Following that same design, at 30% open water, 70% emergent vegetation. And so this wetland here is 7/10 of a hectare, and it takes surface flows from about 15 hectare paddocks. 2 paddocks that average about 15 hectares between the both of them. So really actually a little less expensive. We're treating that water before it even gets into the waterway, and we're doing it higher up in the catchment. And the excavation work itself was only a few $1,000s, but the planting, which this one isn't completely planted yet, is a little bit more. End of field wetland, very similar to end of tile wetland, sorry. We have an open area. This is the Pamahaka down in Otago. There's a tile drain that goes into basically a sediment trap. And you can see there's algal growth there. So there's some nutrients coming in from that subsurface drainage. And then it flows through this wetland. Very simple, easy to build, and fairly effective, especially this one is fairly effective removing nitrogen. One that I like and I've been doing more of the last couple of years is what we're calling in ditch wetlands. We're taking drainage ditches, widening them. I have an open water area here. So it acts as a sediment pond. We can bring a digger in here and clean out sediment. Goes into a shallow wetland that will be planted up, and I'll have a picture of this later. Another open area down here into another shallow wetland and through, and then you don't see there's a big open area down below this culvert here. Sorry, and we found with this, when we do these, you got to make sure you still adequate drainage, but when they're planted up, they actually work pretty well. And we haven't had any problem with drainage. Again, here's another drain ditch wetland, but the drain was too steep, so we had to put what we call grade control structures in. So we lifted the drain up to get this shallow water habitat here. Widened the drain on the one side. We couldn't hit the other side, but we just widened on the other side, and that'll all get planted in native sedges and rushes. and then down into a basin, and then into a culvert that actually flows into the stream. That culvert has a fish ladder on for you, Kim. So we can get some fish habitat in there. If you're interested and want to do a constructed wetland, there's a lot of resources there, and some are very technical, but they do provide you an overview of what you want getting into. Chris Tanner's done a lot of work and is probably the expert on constructed wetlands. Chris Tanner and Darian Zed, Chris Tanner's in NIWA, came out with this constructed wetland practitioner's guide a couple years ago. And it's a very good guide. It has some case studies on the back with some costings and that kind of thing, so you get an understanding of what it's going to cost you if you go into the constructed wetland space. So back to your farm environment plans, you got your maps, and your maps will identify what we call critical source areas. And this low area here would be considered a critical source area because all the runoff from the surrounding land will flow into this area and then down into that stream back here that's filled with pampas grass. This low area is generally low productivity of grasses and be a perfect place for a simple end of field wetland. Actually, this area, this field right here is actually outside Dargaville, and it's one I took a photograph because I looked at it and said, "Oh, this is a perfect place for wetlands," you know. And it is a decent, you could get the size requirement you need to actually treat any runoff coming off that paddock there and go on, and would be relatively inexpensive. So as you're looking at your map, you'll be identifying those critical source areas. You think, all right, can we put a wetland in there to treat nutrients coming off the land into those critical source areas? It's not always straightforward. This is a wetland I did in Kaiwaka. With a friend of mine, and sometimes in the landscape you've got water coming in from different parts of the hill. So when you design your wetland, this one is mainly designed for biodiversity, but still works at improving water quality. We had multiple flow throughs through this wetland because of this. We got water flowing through multiple paths into the wetland. So we wanted to get as much treatment as possible, improve biodiversity, which is why we've elongated, put some channels in, and that ground area is now underwater. That's the shallow water habitat with some deep water. So we're still getting that. This one, because it was biodiversity value, was 50% open water, 50% emergent vegetation. So we're not getting that 730. So, but it's still fairly effective at removing nutrients. When you're dealing with wetlands and nutrients, I would say I always put sediment traps in, and just to protect your wetland, because if you got sediment coming off your land into your wetlands reduces its ability to remove nutrients, and you end up with a dry piece of land if you got too much sediment coming in. So sediment traps are always good designs. This one was designed to take some flows that I didn't think we needed a sediment trap, but I put one in anyways. Just I'm a belts and suspenders type guy, and you can see that algal growth indicating there's a lot of nutrients coming off that, and actually there's a lot of sediment that came down in a 6-month period. So it was well worth spending a couple hours putting a sediment trap in. And then again, with constructed wetlands and water quality improvements, sit down and if you do a big constructed wetland, you need a lot of flat lands. And I've moved to actually what I'm calling treatment chains. So basically the water flows down through, we've got a sediment trap here, which is the sediment trap that was shown previously. Water flows out through here, through this grassed area, which is got planted up in flaxes and native sedges. Down in, this is all wetland area, a little bit of open water. And the reason the open water is there, not up here, is because this guy, the landowner, wanted some open water in front of his little shack there. Down through that whole back area is open water right now, but now it's emergent vegetation. Down into the next wetland, which is emergent vegetation with a little bit of open water in the bottom. So you're getting that 30-70 in there. But we did it over a step period using this gully system that was wettish anyways, and so the farmer didn't lose any really productive land. And sometimes in the winter and late spring, livestock got bogged in there anyways, and so he just like, well, let's do this. And he wanted to improve water quality, but he also wanted biodiversity. And so, but it's a one way of doing it. I've done some treatment chains where we've had we've put some wetlands in and stepped it down, and another 300-400 meters we put another one in, another 4 or 5 we put another one in. We're just taking advantage of the landscape and using the landscape to the best of our advantages, and it seems to be working pretty well. So again, I want to reiterate, when you get your farm environment plans done, which will be done over the next few years, just look at it and you just plan it and say, all right, well, we've got these wetlands, we're going to protect that. That's what we're going to do over the next 2 or 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the road. We might want to restore a few, and then we're in one of these high nutrient areas. Where can we put a few constructed wetlands that will enhance biodiversity, but also improve the water quality flowing off our land? So it's about a farm environment plan can be daunting at a time, but it's just taking a piece by piece, setting your priorities, and just slowly working through them. And I will turn it over to John.
Thank you, Nathan. Yeah, that was awesome. There's a lot of information to digest in there. I've got a couple of questions myself, but I might just go to the chat function. I can see we've got a question in there from Kim Jones. Kim has asked, you mentioned not being able to spray within 10 meters of a wetland. Do you have recommendations on the most efficient way to control weeds around and in wetlands, including after enhancement planting?
Yeah, it's a funny one. There is some movement around that, and there's going to be hopefully some changes in that legislation around what you can and can't use. I think there's going to be some changes that for restoration purposes you'll be able to do some spraying, but right now, last I looked, and it's been a few months, it's still, you can't spray within 10 meters. But again, they might actually, I think they were going to move to allow for hand spraying and stuff in wetlands. So weed control is always a tough one, and especially if you're replanting. It's a bit of a problem. But once you get your system up and going, the hydrology right, and your plants established, weed control gets smaller and smaller. And just have a chat with your regional council around that one, Kim, because it's fraught with issues. And I know that Dairy NZ and Beef and Lamb and Fish and Game have been petitioning the government to change that registration around a little bit to allow for a little bit of leeway. And I think that's what they're going to allow. Some hand spraying for enhancement purposes will be a permitted activity.
Okay, and there was you mentioned a ratio in your presentation. I think it was 70-30. I'm just wondering, could you just clarify what that meant again?
You want 70% for water treatment, for ideal water treatment. You want 30% in shallow water, so that's 300 mils or shallower. So an average about 300 mils, and that's what you need for your growth, your native sedges, rushes, and reeds to grow up. Okay,
and the 30%?
70%.
Yeah, so the 70% of your wetland needs to be shallow water that is not more than
30% deep.
And 30% deep water, which would be sort of up to what? Well, do you want to put some depth around that, or?
Yeah. So probably 1 meter to 1.5 meters deep.
Yeah.
And good that you asked that, because the open water does a lot of things. One thing is by having that deep water, you don't get the vegetation growing in. Route bow does grow into that and will float, and will need a little bit of control. But that open water allows for UV light to hit the water, which will kill your E. coli. Yeah. So it's really important for that. And we found actually in some of the newly constructed wetland, the E. coli numbers jump up because you get newly constructed plants pull off. There's a little bit of issues there, but eventually But you want that for basically E. coli, but it also at the bottom, it also allows you to easily maintain your pipes, because you can see when they're clogged up without having to dig through vegetation and that kind of thing. In general, when we're looking at biodiversity, it's 50-50, 50% shallow water, 50% open. But when you're looking for water quality, NIWA is recommending that 30-70 ratio.
Okay, we've got another question here from Escola, and it says, in areas that have been drained, should we fill all the way the drains, or just blocking it, or just blocking in the outlet is enough to restore hydrology? Sorry, Escola, I couldn't make out your full sentence there, but maybe.
Yeah, I know it. Yep. Actually, I wouldn't even bother filling. It depends. I'll put it depends. It depends upon the slope of the land. If your land's pretty flat with a slope less than 3 to 6%, just block the bottom end of the drain. And to do that properly, you got to clean that drain out, and you got to dig down below it and go down to an impermeable surface to put that blockage in. And simple enough. And then once you get that drain, and then you fill that up with compacted clay soils, and usually you buy those clays from inside. And in a drained landscape wetlands, it's still worth going in after you block the drains, going in and digging out some topography and making some holes and deeper areas and shallow areas, mainly because once it's drained, usually they put livestock on it, and nothing flattens land quicker than livestock except for a bulldozer. So, you never, if you walk in a real wetland, you're always tripping over stuff, you're finding holes and that kind of thing. So you want to imitate that. But yeah, a drain, if you got an open drain wetland, that's an open drains through it, that's the easiest restoration, the cheapest restoration, because you just go down and you block that bottom part. But if it's sloped, like that one picture I had, there was that slope part, I would have probably blocked that drain in several places. And the block doesn't have to be that big, maybe 10 to 15 meters wide.
Okay.
And tied into both sides, past both sides of the drain.
I can see there's a follow-up question from Scott. So it might be good for you to maybe make contact outside of this webinar, and you could perhaps exchange a bit of information around that design. Yep. A couple of points from your webinar, Nathan, or your discussion. There's a lot of pictures with diggers in, so I just want to reiterate that if you're using a digger, it is always a good idea to have a chat with your regional council, just to make sure that you're within the various rules they have around working in wetlands, excavating and moving soil. So that would definitely be the way to go.
Yep, and especially even if you're not in a wetland area, I can't. Sorry, it's been what 6, 7, 8 years since I've been in Northland. There's rules and regulations about how much soil you can move.
That's right. Yeah.
And so always have a chat, develop a relationship with your land management staff up there, with whoever's in your region, and usually if you develop a good relationship with it, you can easily just have these conversations with them, and they can provide you with all that legal side of things.
Yeah. The other thing that was really coming through for me in your presentation was that wetlands are not just for breaking down nutrients. They serve a role for, if they're well designed, for dealing with E. coli in some cases, and for also capturing sediment. You're talking about sediment traps. So yeah, don't think of nutrients just purely wetlands purely as a way to capture nutrients. It's also for the other contaminants, and certainly here in Northland we do worry a lot about E. coli and sediments.
Yep, and it, to me, I'm doing more holistic view when I do with wetlands. I do, a lot of wetlands I've been doing lately have been water quality, but we also add that biodiversity factor onto it. And also remember, which is quite critical right now, after Gabriel and previous storm events that we've had up in Northland and that kind of thing, is actually they're critical in the landscape to holding water back and reducing those peak flooding times and reducing downstream flooding. So it's a win-win-win type thing. And the more wetlands we have, I mean, we're 90% we've lost 90% of our wetlands. And just think about, everybody says wetlands are the liver of the environments, but just think about how effective your liver would be if you lost 90% of your liver. You know, you wouldn't be healthy as a whole. So the land itself isn't healthy. And that's sort of some of the reasons why we have some of the massive floodings and we've lost that biodiversity in those areas, is because we've lost a lot of those areas, those wetlands. So yeah.
And I really liked your comments around treatment chain. So this idea of reading the landscape and putting in sort of networks of smaller wetlands, particularly up here in Northland, we have small catchments, you know, hilly farming landscapes where we can't put in these big expensive, we don't want to put in expensive wetlands anyway, potentially, but finding space for these functional wetlands.
Yep, and a lot of our, most of ours, it's hill country. You know, so you can't find large flat areas to put large wetlands in. And if you put a dam in, you end up with a very deep water and a little bit of a shallow margin, and it's not as effective. And then you've got a dam wall to deal with. So it's just our way, not just mine, but a lot of us who are in the wetlands arena of actually. We've got these ideal designs, you know, but they're not, they don't fit the landscape as well. And it's just using what we have and just taking that and melding that design around the landscape.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I can see there's no more questions in the comments box. So I'll just take this moment to say thank you, Nathan, for making the time to talk to us today. Thank you to those of you that have joined in. I hope you found that interesting. And like I say, this will be available online for you to listen to again or to share if you need to. So kia ora and enjoy your day.